everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm delighted today to be joined by Guy Felio, who is going to take us through some information around asset management in Indigenous communities. And I'm delighted that Guy is able to join us because he was shortlisted for one of our awards last year, and it was really a great honour to meet him in person and have a great conversation. So as I just hand over to Guy, just to let you know, he's having some problems with his camera, so you will be able to hear him and you will be able to see the slides, but unfortunately we don't have the benefit of seeing him. But I can attest he is a real person, and I'm really delighted he's able to join us. If you would like to ask some questions, please put some questions in the questions tab, and we will pick up the questions a bit later on. So thank you. So Guy, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. And again, apologies. Don't know why we're having problems with the camera, but I did everything, and short of restarting the computer, which would be too long. And appreciate Ursula vouching that I am a real person. I am located in Canada, and delighted to be able to talk to you about asset management in Indigenous communities. So really a little bit of my background. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but however, I've been working with First Nations Indigenous communities in Canada since 2007, doing a lot of asset management planning and training, and recently doing extensive work with probably about 7 or 8 First Nations in Ontario, building their asset management competencies and plans as well. Just a little bit of background. I mean, this is the definition of Indigenous peoples from the World Bank, and what is important to remember in this is the fact that really Indigenous communities are very, very grounded to their ancestries, to their lands, to natural resources, and certainly so their identities, their cultures, and livelihoods, which really include a lot of spiritual, cultural heritage, language, and so on, activities and well-being. So when we're doing an asset management plan for Indigenous communities, it's really important to remember these, because their visions and values, and when we're talking about levels of service, for example, they are likely different than what we would see in let's say Western society, urban centers, and so on. In terms of Canadian First Nations, I mean, I'm showing my experience in Canada, but this very likely apply to a lot of different Indigenous communities around the world. In Canada, for example, we have over 630 First Nations communities, as you can see from the map, and there is a reference here if you want to know more about all these communities. A lot of them are basically at the south part of the country, and a lot of them also have ties to Native communities in the United States. But however, also what you see on the map is that we have a number of communities that are in northern Canada. Some of them are very, very remote, and they're small, typically. And I'll give you a little bit of statistics in a few slides. And therefore, being small and remote, then they have their own challenges from an asset management and providing services to their communities, because of lack of accessibility, lots of lack of capabilities and competencies, and so on. There are more than 50 nations represented in Canada, so we're talking about Anishinaabe and the Mohawks and the Cree and so on, and they have a lot of different languages as well. In terms of what is unique with First Nations in Canada, and again I suspect that it is similar in other countries, is that First Nations in Canada are really full service governments. They are responsible not only for what we would call the municipal type services, so your water and wastewater and roads and recreation facilities and so on, but they're also responsible for the housing, the healthcare, education, justice, and other services to their members. And so they really effectively provide services than other Canadians would obtain from their municipal, provincial, and federal government. And so that's important to remember, because when you're doing an asset management plan for these communities, it goes beyond what we would traditionally do for a municipal government. Now, I talked about the size of the First Nations. They're typically small in Canada. There are only two that have populations more than 10,000 members. Now, you will see that I say members as opposed to population, because not all members live in the communities, or what we call on reserve. And therefore, even if they have a population and membership of 10,000, it doesn't mean that they have 10,000 people living in the community. So that is, when you look at it from the perspective of a municipality, that is a very small municipality. But then after that, there's about 7 that have more than 5,000 people, and all the rest are less than that. I'll present you some results of typical example of asset management results later in the presentation, but those results are for a community which is about 320, 330 members. But no matter what their size, they all have to provide the services to their residents. Plus, if there are members that don't live in the community, they still have access to health and education and other services, dental, for example, and so on. So again, is not only the services that they provide to the residents of the community, but also to all the members. Typical images from a community. This is from the Moose Cree First Nation in northern Ontario. It is an island community, so you will see that here, for example, you have some of the cultural assets that they have, some of the educational assets, and the community center and offices, then the residential assets that they have to manage, including electricity, for example, and fuel and so on. An image of the inside of their water treatment plant, and then some other typical municipal type assets that you would find. So drainage system and hydrants, fire hydrants, and so on. Now, I mentioned this is an island, so basically the two slides on the two images on the right, basically during the summer, it is access to the island from the mainland through the river, so either by barges for heavy equipment and gravel for construction and construction equipment and so on, or what you have here, myself with a colleague from one of the Ontario First Nations, taking a water taxi. In the winter, when the river is completely frozen, then it is a winter road, so you can have heavy traffic on it. And then in the shoulder season, so in the spring and fall, when the ice is too thin or there's not enough ice and so on, then the traffic between the island and the mainland is done by helicopter. Now, this community is very progressive, so they are now, in terms of bringing food and medication and other things, including some light vehicles by drones. But the image that you see here, helicopter, this is basically their school bus, taking the kids from the community and bringing them in the morning to the mainland to go to school, and coming back in the evening to go back home. So again, a completely different setting that you would find in many of the cities that we have in Canada. So in terms of the what's been happening with asset management in First Nations in Canada, well, when I think about the 7 questions of asset management, or the 6 or 10 blocks of asset management from from IAM and so on, this comes from a best practice guide that was produced in Canada a while ago. But basically, you're talking about your building blocks of getting the inventory, getting the valuation, so replacement values, having information on the condition and service life of the assets, what you need to do and when, and then developing your capital and O&M plans, and the rest is what would be the sustainability issues in terms of your assets, what you need to do, what is an acceptable level of risk, and so on. Now, the reason that you see some that are in green and red is because First Nations communities in Canada have been collecting a lot of data for the last 20 years, asset data actually. And so what I have here, and I'm just going to explain what these acronyms are very quickly. But basically, this is the integrated condition management system. This is the asset condition reporting system, and PSAB is the Public Sector Accounting Board. This is Public Sector 3150, which is the accounting requirement of reporting on the value of assets on an annual basis through the financial statements of the community, and this applies to First Nations. And there, without going into the details here, but what you will see here is that a lot of asset data has been collected. Some of it from a condition reporting that is required by the federal government for First Nations to do an asset condition assessment every 3 years for the assets that they are responsible for, that the federal government pays. The accounting reporting is for all the assets, and obviously insurance is for all the assets that the community is responsible for. So when you think about all this, there have been a lot of data accumulated, but really never has been a consolidation of all these data to support the development of an asset management plan. And this is where our role comes in, is not to go and collect new data, because they already have that. They do a lot of reports on their assets and their planning and so on. But basically what we do, and what I do when I'm supporting these communities, is to start looking at their life cycle costing, their life cycle needs. What are some of the performance indicators? Start looking at risks that they may be exposed to, including climate change, and there are programs by the federal government in Canada that supports climate risk assessments, and then developing the asset management plans that include looking at the funding gaps that they have. So again, we're not reinventing the wheel here. What we're saying is that provide us with all the data that you have. We'll consolidate it as part of our asset management planning exercise, and then after that we'll enrich it with or add value through life cycle analysis and so on. So a couple of principles that I use when I'm explaining asset management to the First Nations in the basically phase of building awareness about the asset management within a community. So the first one, as you know, as asset managers, it's all about the service. So basically what we are looking at is, if the asset does not provide a service, question yourself and say, do we really need that asset? And service, obviously, from the First Nations community is broad, because it also includes the spiritual well-being, the cultural heritage, and so on. But still, if the asset does not provide a service, then question yourself, do we need it? The second one is really looking at the levels of service, and when the community is providing the service, defining the quality. And as you know, levels of service means different things to different people, and so you have to define what you want to achieve, what is affordable, what is desirable. Is there a willingness to pay for this? And typically, I ask the question to the members of the community and to the stakeholders, what does it mean to you? But I also tell the managers of the technical people of the First Nations, you have to remember that really, what is the expectation from the public and from the members and the users of the service, and really what they are interested is, when you flush, it goes away. That's what they want to know. And if it doesn't go away, then they'll call their council member, or they'll call their director of public works and say, hey, we have a problem. They're not really interested in knowing about the pumps and the valves and the pipes and what kind of materials the pipes are made of and so on. They really want to focus on the service that is related to what they use. And they want to know also what happens if the service fails. What are you going to do? You responsible for our assets. And so those are the kind of things that we want the community or the staff of the First Nation to start thinking about when they're looking at service. And obviously, as we all know, with levels of service come operation and maintenance requirements, and therefore, there are costs associated with that. And these costs can be very high compared to the acquisition or the construction of the assets. It can be 4 times higher. And the other thing is that all these infrastructure assets and services are interrelated. You cannot have a house that is not connected to the water, wastewater, roads, and electricity, and so on. And if one of those services fails, then it will have impact on others. Now, I use this a lot when I'm doing the presentations to First Nations, because this is, as you know, the iceberg analogy in terms of the acquisition cost versus all the operation, training, repairs, maintenance, and so on, and the iceberg analogy. But I also use these two that are really sources that are credible sources, but also referenced. This comes from housing costs from British Columbia, and basically it shows that about 70% of the life cycle costs are for maintenance, repairs, renewals, and operations, and so on, while only about 26 are related to construction and design. And another image here of this pie showing that O&M is about 70 to 80%. And this is important. Unfortunately, our procurement systems are trying to reduce this 20%. How much is going to cost to build, but they don't focus on reducing the other 70%. So there is a disconnect here between life cycle costs and procurement, but this is a long battle to fight, and I'm not ready to fight it yet. In terms of the drivers, again, what drives asset management in First Nations is very similar to what has been driving asset management in municipalities and councils and so on, is a whole range of pressures on the communities. For example, aging infrastructure, higher levels of service demand, changing regulations, certainly has a big effect when the regulations for water treatment change. Then, therefore, there's expenses in the systems. Population growth, as opposed to other communities, the population growth on First Nations communities is about 2% and maybe as high as 4%. That compared to population growth without immigration in Canada, this is much higher, and therefore that puts pressure on the services, because remember that these First Nations provide services that are beyond just your traditional water and wastewater, but also housing, which is a big issue in First Nations communities, education, health, and so on. As many communities, they have limited financial resources. They also have increased accountability, more and more reporting to do. but also climate change is having impacts. And when we're talking about levels of service, I use these three images here, and I tell them, no, this is not a slide or images of roads in your community. This just happens to be all roads within 3 kilometers of where I live, and I live near the capital, Ottawa, in Canada. A number of ingredients of success as well that make sure that we can have a successful asset management planning and sustain asset management within the community in the long term. Certainly the engagement of the chief and council, buy-in, support, including developing and adopting an asset management policy. Certainly the champion, having a champion, that can mobilize people, drive asset management forward, whether an elected official, whether a senior management or somebody that is senior within the organization that is very respected, that is the champion that we need. As you know, the cross-departmental or multidiscipline team, including as a minimum, that put a requirement that if I'm gonna help you do asset management, you need to have these people around the table: finance, public works, housing, engineering, operations, and planning experience. And that is the core team. And typically, the first meetings, finance will say, well, I don't know what I'm doing here. And public works say, yeah, but I don't have time. And then we basically, have discussions about what will be the benefits of asset management for each of those functions. And at the end of the meetings, usually they see value in participating, and they become engaged. Certainly, you need resources, so having human, material, and financial resources. An advantage that First Nations have, and it's been the case as well for municipalities, is that there are a lot of funding from the federal government that supports development of asset management plans. So they are getting funds to do the asset management plans, pay some of their salaries, and also hire people to support them and accompany them in their journey, as well as partnerships. So now we have many First Nations that have been doing asset management plans, including some that are tribal councils, so groups of 5, 6 First Nations that have gone through the process. We also have the Canadian Network of Asset Managers. We have also the IAM Canada chapters and so on. So there are a lot of resources and networks that are there, and I typically encourage them to join some of these networks so that they can continue learning and progress in their journey. I talked a little bit about what's been happening with asset management in First Nations in the past, but really, it really started back in 1983 when the federal government developed their handbook on operational funding and for community infrastructure, education, and operations and maintenance program, and that was updated as well. But there was also a capital facilities and maintenance program in 1998 and for First Nations, and this is currently under reform because it's formula based. And out of this came a number of documents, including a Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, which basically is a cost reference manual. Now, it is a very, very extensive and very well done cost reference manual, although unfortunately, it has not been updated since 2005, apart from some basic cost indices that basically inflation costs that update the numbers. And as we know, the consumer price index is really not a representative or relevant cost index for infrastructure, and so there is always a discrepancy or difference between the update of the cost reference manual and the reality of things. But however, it is still used, and I still use it, but using the right inflation factors. The asset condition reporting system I talked about, so condition assessments done every 3 years for all the assets that are funded by the federal government, a number of programs, and then in 2009, which applied to all public agencies, including First Nations and municipalities, was the accounting rule PSAP 3150, the tangible capital assets reporting. And started before COVID, and it's kind of slowed down because of COVID, but picking up steam again is the asset management initiative between the ISC, which is the Indigenous Services Canada federal department, and the Assembly of First Nations. So there are a lot of movement, a lot of things that have been happening, but also a lot of development of asset management plans across First Nations, in anticipation that this initiative here will change the way the funding is provided to these First Nations for infrastructure, CapEx and OpEx. And I use this to illustrate that, basically when we're looking at asset data, we are looking at the same data, whether it is for asset management, risk management, or accounting reporting. And if I go like this, basically you will see that from the asset management, we take the information about condition, inventory, residual life, and so on. We do an analysis of it. We incorporate levels of service. We look at O&M practices, and then we come up with needs in terms of capital and O&M investments. We do our life cycle plans. We do our investment plans, and then after that, there is an asset management plan. Well, from a risk management perspective, we use the same data, but then after that, we add what would be the hazards. We talk about risk tolerance. We talk about impact chains. So if one asset fails, what would happen on the others? And then we talk about risk treatment, which that risk treatment can be and should be incorporated into the life cycle plan. So at one point when you need to do some rehab on the assets, you want to have basically incorporate adaptation or restricted measures. But from the financial asset reporting, you basically work with the same data, and that's what's important, because building the inventory that can be used for asset management, risk management, and financial asset reporting is a major task, and it requires taking 3 or 4, maybe more databases, consolidating them together, and after that making sure that there is consistency, any discrepancies have been removed, and hopefully that consolidated database will be used by all the different functions, including those that are doing risk assessments or risk management, those that are doing asset reporting, those that are doing asset management. In terms of the tools, the 2 main tools that I wanted to talk about very briefly, both of 2021. The first, the one on the left here, is an asset management guide for British Columbia First Nations. Both, this one is available publicly. The other one is a toolkit. I'm proud to have been part or the lead author of developing this toolkit for the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation. It has 3 modules. Module 1 is data sources and data structure. Module 2 is climate risk assessment, and Module 3 is asset management. And really, Module 2 and Module 3 were developed so that they could, integrate into each other. And this is the module that I have been using. The first version was developed in 2017, and this was revised in 2021. Typical framework that we used in this module. You've seen this or variations of it. There's nothing new about it. It talks about the building blocks of using of developing the asset portfolio, doing life cycle analysis, looking at the needs assessment, and developing management and investment plans. All this driven by the governance and levels of service. And then there is the monitoring and reporting, so on. So again, nothing really new about this, but certainly something that there. I'm proud to say that the First Nations Toolkit won an Ontario Consulting Awards back in 2019. At the time as well, we were doing intensive capacity development and training in First Nations in Ontario. So we went across the province, did 10 locations, and had more than 80 First Nations represented and more than 200 participants. So really, it was not only developing the guide, but also doing the capacity development for this. It is anchored, this toolkit, into ISO 55000 series. All of you know about it, so I'm just putting them because I just want to forget that really we did not want to develop a toolkit that was isolated from the international standards, and that also basically gives credibility to the toolkit, because when the federal government asks, well, this toolkit here, or this asset management planning tool, is really only for First Nations and doesn't represent what's happening, elsewhere, and we said nope. This is anchored and complies and aligned to and conforms to the international standard ISO 55000, and many of you have been involved in development of the standard. As you know, it is undergoing some revisions. I was part of the committee that developed the first series back in 2010 to 2014, and therefore important to basically say no, the toolkit aligns with this, and I use this, as you have seen in the past, to illustrate that they have been managing their assets, but by doing asset management, and it will structure those activities. Now, maybe the only thing that is different from what you see in the traditional or the ISO 55000 is that I added this here. When you see that the realized value, which is the language of the standard. I have added this because, from public sector perspectives, value equals providing services. So I just want to emphasize that this is related to the services that are being provided to the community members. And we also go through the various elements of asset management. So being driven by the community vision, the mission, and its values. As you know, the organizations, including First Nations, have strategic plans. So they will have economic development plan, the housing strategy, and so on. But really, the three main building blocks of the asset management activities within the community are the policy, and which will support the people doing asset management within the organization, the strategy and roadmap, which basically is a very dynamic and living document, because, for example, I just completed, last end of 2023, completed one asset management plan for a community. We had a strategy and roadmap, and now they asked me to update it. Now, as part of this, we will do a self-assessment, and they have progressed tremendously from the first time that we did the self-assessment to now. So again, you just modify and move on with the strategy and the roadmap, and then obviously the asset management plans. Now I'm just going to show you some slides of what the results look like graphically, and I use those to show their chief and council and say, well, what do you expect from the asset management plan in figures? So the first thing that we do when we're doing the awareness is doing the asset management initiative awareness report. So this is where, in terms of awareness, we do a lot of workshopping and planning and presentations. We do the self-assessment, we do a draft policy, and we do the strategy and roadmap. This is what typically I show in terms of the graphic of the self-assessment. This is just one way of illustrating it, but we have four categories, corporate asset management being one, and then there's some subcategories related to levels of service, risk management, climate change, policy, and so on. And for this particular community, they are probably at the beginning of level 2, and they want to progress to level 3. And we have a number of actions that can be short-term and medium-term that are identified. validated, and that those actions, short and medium term, then become part of their strategy and their roadmap. So very easy for them to identify where they are at, and I tell them that we don't expect you to be at level 5 when you finish this, but that you're progressing. In terms of the planning, this is where we basically do the asset management planning, and the sources of information comes, as I mentioned, through the funded assets by the federal government, inspection and condition assessment reports, the PSAB reports, list of insured assets, the housing assets, and also the Indigenous Services Canada operations and maintenance funding. And it's all consolidated into an asset management inventory and verified by the First Nation staff. So this is what it looks like. This is a community which has about 320 members residing on reserve. As you can see that, for a large part of the portfolios, the residential assets, which in a municipality, a lot of these will be private assets, which are not part of their asset management planning. Buildings as well, so that includes health and education and so on. So this is the typical picture that we see, and actually this was from the 2022 asset portfolio. I did the 2023 recently, and they had 3 net assets that were added. 2 were housing and 1 was fleet. Then we're looking at the value of these assets, and you can see that this is a community of, like I said, about 320, 350 people, and they have to manage $62.5 million Canadian dollars worth of assets. And so when you present that to the chief and council, suddenly they have the realization that their role in regard to asset management is huge. Then there's various graphs that are presented, and this is the age of assets. So what happened in 2022 is that they had a brand new treatment plant with a number of pumping stations and so on. So therefore, an increase in $14 million worth of assets. But by looking at that, you can start looking at, okay, well, you have here a block worth about $4 million that is residential, that are getting into the 40 years of age, and that may be getting close to their end of life. We also have, and it's all Excel spreadsheet based, capital asset replacement 20-year forecast, plus looking at breaking down the assets in various categories. We identify a deficit, so this is all the assets that are past the due date, and typically what we see is that they're prolonging the life of assets like municipalities do, except that because of lack of operations and maintenance monies, their assets are deteriorating faster than in other municipalities. We break it down into subcomponents. For example, residential, here you have it by the structure, foundations, and so on. Those are just details that help planning. And then we do the forecast in terms of estimated annual O&M investments, so separating operations and maintenance. And this is what it looks like for that particular community. So we're talking about buildings and residential assets that are taking, again, a large chunk of what they need in terms of O&M. But what's important as well is to look at, well, O&M for a lot of assets that they have is funded by the Indigenous Services Canada. But still, it's not enough. So what they're getting from the federal government is about 25% of the total, and they have to come up with the other 75%. Now, remember that their financial situations and funding situations are different. They don't have property taxes because basically the residential properties belong to the band council. So there's no revenue from property taxes on this. So they have to come up with the funding to pay for these O&M costs. So in summary, just in 1 or 2 minutes, is the approach that I have been taken in terms of asset management planning in First Nations is really to be a guide in their journey. My intent is for them to be self-sufficient in terms of updating and sustaining asset management in the long term. And so it is as a guide, and the approach is really a journey one. So setting up the objectives of where you want to be, where you want to go, looking at the fitness of the organization for the journey. So the self-assessment, helps, and looking at the capabilities. Interestingly enough, three of the First Nations that I'm working with now have decided that they will hire an asset manager for their communities, and that asset manager will also will be supporting the housing manager. So now they have a function which is asset manager, which is great to see in these communities. We're also building the team. So I mentioned before this cross-service representation, and then plan the roadmap for the journey, where you want to do by when, and can you do it, and what will be some of the obstacles that you will have. Training, so capacity building, capacity development, and capacity enhancement, because a lot of these community representatives have knowledge about managing assets, but just need to go the step further, and really preparing for the journey and starting the journey itself. And I consider that the journey really starts when we have the first awareness meetings. The approach as well is to really celebrate arriving at the first milestone. So I am in the process of celebrating with one community, where we're presenting actually tomorrow, to the chief and council, and we're celebrating the fact that they have their first asset management plan, and this is what it looks like, and they are ready to continue their journey without having me accompanying them. Just in case that there is an emergency, then they know where to reach me. And the other part is really developing a sustainability, an asset management sustainability plan. What do they need in terms of material and so on? There's some additional initiatives that are related to that, but I'm not going to go through them. But at least you'll have the slides and you can look at them. And that basically concludes my presentation. So thank you very much. Again, I apologize for not being on camera, but I'll take any questions that you might have if you do. Thank you.
Guy, thank you. It's really, really interesting, fascinating insight into what is happening in a lot of the First Nations organisation, communities, to really think about their asset management. We have got a number of questions that have come in whilst you've been presenting. So if you're happy to take some questions, I'll sort of read them out, and I'll hand over to you to see if you can tackle them. So the first one is, will the slides be shared with the attendees? So if you're comfortable, we'll provide those slides alongside the recording. Are you okay with that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure.
The second one is from David Capling, and he's asked, do you include emergency response, evacuation, and asset recovery for remote communities within the asset management provision?
Absolutely. And emergency response and first responders, and because remember that also these communities are responsible for health, so they will also have paramedics as part of the teams, and they have in the health building, so we include them. Now they become really critical when we're looking at the risk assessment and the risk management, because they are the ones that are going to be dealing with the residual risk that the community cannot manage. And therefore, the short answer is yes.
Thank you. The next question comes from Seda Raymond, and they ask, for remote communities, did you consider asset classifications as movable and fixed?
So we in the asset management planning, the most of the assets are fixed. So the traditional buildings and linear systems and so on. We also include vehicles, and in some cases, what we have found is that they have movable assets which are residential. So for example, trailers and so on that they use in emergency cases, or that they use for big cultural or heritage events like powwows. So those are included. Those are included, and we basically look at all the assets. Now there's a particular threshold that we use in terms of value of assets, and but it's not only value but also service life. So in many instances, we just lump the assets in various categories to be able to handle them from an asset management perspective.
Thank you. The next question comes from Seda again, and they ask any comments on subsidiary-based services and revenue generation assets for the smaller communities? Because I mean, you talked about how small some of these communities are, and their need to do some of the revenue generation, etc.
So what I have seen is partnerships by a number of First Nations in an area to support touristic and cultural activities, and that generates revenues. So there's a sharing of the revenues. There's some that are fairly advanced in terms of developing economic activities. And now what we're also seeing more and more is partnerships between those communities with resource extraction companies, because they have land reserves that contain a lot of natural resources that, for example, I mean, we see, the rare earth minerals that we use for a number of things. A lot of them are located on their traditional lands. So there's these partnerships developing, which will generate revenues certainly for them, and therefore allow them to enhance the level of service and the condition of the assets.
Thank you, Guy. So the next question is from Wendy Stadden. It says, great presentation, really interesting, thank you. What prompted the adoption of this approach? Is it a standard Canadian approach driven by regional government or by the First Nations themselves?
So the approach that the approach is anchored in ISO 55000 and some of the other well-recognized frameworks. So the approach is slightly different because of the nature of the First Nations themselves and their values. And for example, we work a lot with elders that have traditional knowledge and so on, which you would not find. So itself, I would say that is driven by the First Nations themselves, by their cultural values, by their heritage values, and so on. The regional or provincial or federal government, they're interested in knowing that the process is reliable, is credible, and that it is repeatable. And therefore, having this link to existing frameworks and existing standards provides that level of credibility.
Thank you, Guy. And then the last question, unless anyone pops in another one, is from Brantford Warner, and it's around skills. So how do you get around the huge skills gap? Do you mentor and coach asset management practitioners?
Yes, that's the short answer. Now, also the way that they're organized in many of these communities, the First Nations are affiliated with a tribal council, and the tribal council may represent 5, 6, sometimes 10 First Nations, and therefore they can acquire the technical capabilities to serve those the First Nations that are affiliated with the tribal council. So whenever I'm working, for example, on asset management planning, I always work with the representatives of the tribal council as well, because they have the capabilities. For example, one of the tribal councils I'm working with, they basically are doing the custodians of the GIS system, that therefore the individual communities can access to for their own assets and so on, which as an individual community they would not be able to do it, but now it is centralized through the tribal council. So So there are ways of using the existing relationships that they have with various organizations to build that capacity and those skills and competencies, so that, again, my goal is for them to be self-sustaining in terms of doing asset management in the future.
Guy, many thanks for your presentation and for all the work you're doing in this space and getting the message out there to everyone about the work that's going on. I think there's a lot. You talked about the ability for a number of the First Nations to engage with other asset management communities, to build their networks and share. And I think there's a lot we can learn in both directions. And so I found it as an absolutely fascinating presentation and a really interesting topic. And we look forward to seeing how it advances. I wanted to thank everyone for joining the webinar. And for all of your really interesting questions as well. They're really, really insightful and interesting questions to really sort of really dig into the presentation that Guy gave. So thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.